To this session, plenary session, the Raymund Schwager Awards. Someone remarked this morning, the Schwager Award comes home. And I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. This award started, I asked Anna Stell earlier today, and she told me in the year 2005 at Schoenstatt, it was the first time it was given. And it was our way of honoring the memory of one of our founders. And it was consciously meant to honor him as a teacher. And we're lucky today that one of the winners is a grandchild of Raymund Schwager, an intellectual grandchild, and that his dissertation was directed by Joseph. So it's just very appropriate what we're doing here today. So I'll introduce each speaker as they begin. Each will be given 30 minutes. I've encouraged them to use 20 of it for speaking and then the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So our first speaker is Columcille. He is a theology PhD candidate in the program for the history of Christianity in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation is on the 3rd century North African Tertullian theologian from Carthage, and this is his first cover. So please, Colin.
Good evening. Thank you to Professor Dr. Ahlberg for the introduction, and to all of our hosts here at Universität Innsbruck, especially to Professor Dr. Vandegar and to Professor Dr. Regensberger. I'm extremely honored to be here and grateful for the opportunity. My paper this evening is entitled Envy Loves to Hide, Chrysostom Unmasking Envy on Cain's Fallen Face, Our Fallen Nature. Although the reputation of the emotions as objects of philosophical, anthropological, socio-psychological, and even theological inquiry has been on the rise in contemporary scholarship in recent decades, the reputation of envy and the other rivalrous emotions has remained comparatively low. Those familiar with classical analyses of these emotions will not be surprised by the enduring disapprobation of envy and its kissing cousins, jealousy, malice, indignation, strife, ambition, and hatred, since the ancients almost universally held these emotions to be irredeemably malicious passions, unfit for decent people, and generally harmful to the body politic. Christian theologians, for their part, inherited large swaths of the lexicon of the rivalrous emotions from their philosophical predecessors, but had been given a new pattern of use in which the theological meaning of these terms might be disclosed, namely the Christian scripture. Envy and its relatives, especially emulation, appear throughout the New Testament and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, which taken together constituted a narrative whole for early Christian theologians. As exegetes and preachers, these theologians help their congregations situate themselves within the biblical narrative, thereby enabling them to revision the world. Within the storied world revealed in the scriptures, therefore, the philosophical program of identifying and healing the rivalrous emotions took on a renewed significance for early Christian theologians, and in particular for the golden-mouthed preacher from Antioch, John Chrysostom. Chrysostom was educated in rhetoric during the middle of the 4th century, a course of study that required familiarity with various philosophical discourses, including considerations of the emotions and their role in moral formation. When his rhetorical studies came to an end, he retired to the tranquil life in a Christian monastic community and immersed himself in the study of the scriptures, in which he discovered insights at once familiar and strange. This fusion of horizons was born out of his proclamation of the Genesis narrative, beginning in Antioch sometime in early 385, from Lent into Easter on the liturgical calendar, prior to his ordination to the priesthood in 386. In this sermon series, he treats the narrative of Cain and Abel, in which he discerns the passion of envy and its disastrous consequences for human flourishing. Chrysostom's focus on envy is perhaps surprising in light of the fact that the language of envy is absent from the narrative. Chrysostom thus relies on an approach similar to that of Robert Castor and Ed Sanders, for whom the emotional language of a particular culture is never ultimately determined by lexical data, apart from what Sanders describes as emotional episodes or scenarios that represent a specific instance of a general script. In this essay, therefore, I attempt to sketch several constitutive features of envy's narrative scripts, drawing on the philosophical treatments of envy in antiquity and deriving additional conceptual resources from modern scholarship, particularly that of René Girard. I then turn to Chrysostom's theological interpretation of the story of Cain and Abel, highlighting the central moral and psychological difficulty in the narrative, acknowledged by Chrysostom's Jewish and Christian contemporaries. In the final sections, I describe Chrysostom's procedure for unmasking envy and how that unmasking enables him to script envy's cure within his congregation. Chrysostom's unmasking of envy as the root of Cain's fratricide both discloses the essential hiddenness of envy to its subjects and initiates a therapeutic discourse aimed at curing the envy latent in his congregation through the recommendation of practices of confession, almsgiving, and emulation. Philosophical perspectives on envy. Here, I take my point of departure from Aristotle, whose treatise On Rhetoric offers the first systematic account of the emotions in antiquity. Aristotle defines envy as, quote, a certain kind of distress, lupe, at apparent successes on the part of one's peers in attaining good things. Not that a person may get anything for himself, but because of those who have them. Three features are noteworthy. First, envy is classed among those emotions that evoke painful feelings in their subject, like indignation or pity. Unlike these emotions, however, Aristotle argues that envy is felt exclusively by those with a bad character. In this respect, envy's counterpart is spite, or the pleasure felt at the misfortune of one's peers. Since envy and spite were associated with the small soul, the mikrosukioi, as well as those of low or mean character, coping mechanisms for dealing with envy often involve psychological processes of denial. As John Elster has argued, envy is, quote, the only emotion we do not want to admit to others or to ourselves, end quote. It loves to hide, especially in the narratives the envious tell themselves about their own desires and those who frustrate them. Second, envy involves a judgment about what counts as good or desirable. Aristotle argues that goods evocative of envy include all things that cause people to love fame and honor, as well as those things which make people desire attention and the gifts of fortune. This feature of Aristotle's description of envy highlights the cognitive dimension of the emotions that has figured prominently in Martha Nussbaum's critical retrieval of classical Greco-Roman theories of the emotions. She argues that the emotions should not be considered, quote, feelings that well up in some natural and untutored way from our natural selves, end quote, but that they are contrivances, social constructs, that are learned in the same way that beliefs are learned, primarily through stories told within particular political communities. Aristotle's emotions are thus, quote, the emotions of citizens, reinforced by shared beliefs and judgments about the world, which serve as the necessary conditions for the emotions themselves. In the case of envy, late ancient Mediterranean societies shared the concept of the limited good, which informed the agonistic nature of those societies, especially with respect to those goods associated with honor. Such goods were thought to exist in finite quantities, and competition for them was a zero-sum game. The acquisition of honor by one's peers always meant the loss of honor for oneself. Finally, envy's object is not the real or perceived good, but its possessor, and that person, insofar as she or he is equal and similar to iso kai omoyo, to oneself. Aristotle provides a catalog of possible equals, which includes similarities in birth, relationship, age, disposition, reputation, and wealth, as well as the proximity of time and place. Envy is also felt, according to Aristotle, towards anyone who desires the same goods as oneself, including erotic attention and commercial profit. Unlike emulation, in which the subject desires whatever good is possessed by his or her object without desiring to deprive them of it, Envy is not primarily concerned with one's own lack of some good. The envious person simply feels pain at the fact that another possesses some good thing, whether or not their possession of it is deserved. René Girard has shed significant light on this third feature of envy in his account of mimetic desire. According to Girard, the acquisitive behavior of human beings is fundamentally mimetic, constituted by a subject, object, and a rivalrous other, who mediates the desirability of the object to the subject. When this mediation remains external, the risk for violent conflict between rivals is mitigated. Each operates within different spheres of possibility which do not overlap. Internal mediation, however, involves the desire for the same goods within the same sphere of activity, that is, between agents equally capable of achieving such goods. According to this form of mediation, the desirable object gradually recedes from the view of both the subject and the rival, who come to double one another. Turning against each other with rage in their hearts, Girard writes, each sets upon the other as a mimetic rival. This rage is the fruit of envy, which leads to what Girard calls metaphysical desire, the desire to be the rivalrous other, to supplant the other in a total identification in which the other and the other's desire becomes the subject's actual object. Metaphysical desire is felt acutely by Girard's doubles, who come to think that their satisfaction can only occur with the annihilation of the object of their envy. According to Girard, the confrontation of doubles is, quote, the climactic moment that twins embody, or the enemy brothers of mythology, or, I add, those biblical brothers, Cain and Abel. Envy within the biblical narrative. Girard refers to the biblical narrative of Cain and Abel in different contexts throughout his works, often in relation to doubles, whose rivalry with respect to some limited good provokes one or both to violence. Girard's claim that envy motivated Cain's murderous action shares striking similarities with Jewish and Christian interpretations of that narrative in late antiquity. As such, I will briefly address the major moral or psychological difficulty commonly identified by late antique readers of the Cain and Abel narrative in Genesis 4, verses 1 to 16, in order to contextualize the interpretation. I will then proceed to offer Chrysostom's unmasking of envy in the homilies that he offered on Genesis in Antioch. This compressed narrative does not clearly identify the motive of Cain's fratricide. Indeed, the brothers hardly relate to one another in the story. Each brings something to the Lord, who looks upon Abel's gift in such a way that his disregard of Cain's offering, or even sacrifice or victim, the words in the Septuagint are different. Abel offers gifts and Cain offers sacrifices. Cain then invites Abel into the field and kills him. For most late antique interpreters, the search for a possible motive begins with Cain's emotional response to the rejection of his offering. The Masoretic text, as well as the Syriac Peshitta, suggest that Cain's primary emotional state is anger. Quote, Cain was very incensed and his face fell. Genesis 4:5 in Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew. Jewish exegetes often focused on the darkness of Cain's fallen face as the consequence of his burning anger, drawing connections to Ezekiel 24:10 and the Psalms 102:4. Hatred also figures into the exegetical traditions as a kind of intensified anger, coupled with the desire that the object of one's hatred cease to exist. Sorrow, as a form of distress, lupe, is considered, though not without close connection to those emotions that issue in violence against their object. Although the Greek text in the Septuagint resists a straightforward reading of anger as Cain's emotional response to the Lord's preference for Abel's gifts, Jewish and Christian interpreters together occasionally identify the specter of envy haunting the narrative. Jewish interpreters etymologically linked Cain's name to either envy or acquisition. Philo and Josephus both do this. Some going so far as to associate Cain's parentage with the diabolical envy mentioned in Wisdom 2:24, violent death having entered the human world with Cain's primordial murder. Some readers also claimed that Cain and Abel were twins, thereby heightening the possibility of their rivalry through the internal mediation of their desire for God's favor. Some Christian interpreters, especially those reading the Greek text, interpret Cain's distress, that lupe, as the initial pain characteristic of envy, which subsequently manifests itself in Cain's annihilation of his rival. That having been said, the other emotions discussed above often occlude the primacy of envy, on which Chrysostom insists. Chrysostom's Unmasking. Chrysostom's analysis of the motivation behind Cain's murder begins with the discussion of the passion of envy. Cain's distress, he argues, was the result of both his rejection and, crucially, the acceptance of Abel's offering. Cain's rejection identifies his failure to obtain the desirable good of God's favor. Cain's subsequent elimination of his putative rival for that good suggests that Cain conceived of that favor as limited. He then directs the pain of his own rejection at his brother Abel, Girard's rivalrous other, who had attracted the favor of God. Chrysostom amplifies the narrative and transmutes the impulse of terrible envy into Cain's anger, his unbridled fury, and his hatred, which cumulatively lead to the deceptive invitation onto the isolated plain and the eventual murder. These colorful descriptions of the anger that is rooted in envy resonates with Chrysostom's subsequent account of the scope of satanic agency in the story, which he explicitly frames in terms of Wisdom 2:24, quote, "Through the devil's envy, death entered the world," end quote. Chrysostom highlights the diabolical wickedness that does not, quote, "take kindly to the prosperity of others," end quote. Chrysostom is adamant throughout that Cain was free to choose the confession of his ingratitude towards God and thereby regain his privileged status as the elder brother. Cain's failure cannot therefore be attributed to diabolical agency, except insofar as Cain's ingratitude to God imitates that of Satan. Chrysostom's final mention of Cain in the Genesis Homilies occurs in his account of Joseph, which sheds further light on Chrysostom's judgment that envy is a, quote, "ruinous passion of ill will that demonstrates its typical force in the corruption of fraternal charity." As in the case of Cain, it is the fratricidal intention of Joseph's brothers that conceals their envy from themselves, but manifests it, according to Chrysostom, to whoever reads the narrative with precision. Indeed, the terrible passion of envy consumes its subject, both by introducing sin into the soul and by reversing its own intention, rendering envy's object, according to Chrysostom, more conspicuous, more esteemed, more famous, which, he argues, proves another severe blow to the envious person. For all his attention to Cain's envy, however, Chrysostom emphasizes that the victor in the contest was in fact Abel, the one who was killed, who even up to the present time is on everyone's lips as a model, end quote. Chrysostom's account of Cain's envy thus reflects classical features of that passion, namely the pain felt by the envious subject, the judgment that a particular desirable good was limited, and the rivalrous other as envy's true object. Girard further illuminates Chrysostom's account of the way in which these pieces move towards their violent conclusion. In Chrysostom's retelling, after hearing the Lord's rebuke, Cain's desire is no longer oriented towards receiving the good of divine favor, but to the annihilation of Abel. Cain freely chooses to reject the Lord's offer of forgiveness through the practice of confession and diabolically accuses his brother rather than himself for the frustration of his desire. In what follows, I argue that Chrysostom's proclamation of this biblical narrative intends to unmask the envy latent in his congregation by juxtaposing the negative example of Cain with the positive examples of both Abel's gratitude and the Lord's long suffering. Chrysostom scripting a cure. The Lord's vindication of the victim is not the only point of consideration highlighted in the course of these homilies. Throughout, Chrysostom attempts to script a cure for the envy lying in wait for his congregation in the agonistic social world of 4th century Antioch. He develops 3 main strategies to this end, which depend upon his audience's recognition of Cain's envy. Chrysostom's therapeutic strategies for healing envy in his congregation are situated within his theological vision of God's involvement with his creatures and the imitation of the well-ordered responses of some among those creatures to God's activity narrated in the Scripture. First, Chrysostom traces the origins of Cain's sacrifice to the knowledge associated with conscience, which enabled Cain to perceive God's provision of an outlet for human gratitude. Although the Lord has no need for sacrifices, Chrysostom is adamant on that point, he desires the cultivation of gratitude. Chrysostom focuses on 2 counterfactuals attentive to this cultivation. First, had Cain recognized Abel's gratitude for God, the gratitude at the heart of his offering of a gift to the Lord, Chrysostom suggests, he would not have viewed Abel as a double, his likeness to him being interrupted by his grateful disposition. Nor would he have continued to affirm that his own sacrifice merited the Lord's favor. Second, Had Cain responded to the Lord's offering of forgiveness with confession of his own unworthiness, he would have paradoxically placed himself in a position to receive the favor initially withheld from him. Chrysostom argues that confession can become the kind of sacrifice that produces gratitude in those willing to acknowledge their status as creatures before the Lord. Furthermore, showing gratitude to God by confessing one's faults allows the confessing subject to delight in the favor shown to others as a manifestation of God's unlimited goodness, equally accessible to all. The second strategy Chrysostom devises to mitigate the passion of envy involves a revisioning of the world from the eschatological perspective of the Scriptures. Chrysostom writes, quote, "We will not cease addressing you each day and making your ears ring with the talk of the noblest way of life, so that you may eradicate those deadly passions, I mean anger, envy, and jealousy," end quote. Chrysostom argues that each of these passions are rooted in the obsession with material goods or with acquisitive behavior more generally. Chrysostom intends to eradicate the insatiable desire for possessions in his congregation, including the desire for the good opinion of others, who have learned how to judge what is good from a society fundamentally at odds with Scripture's judgments. He recommends almsgiving as the means to true esteem in the eyes of God and detachment from worldly goods. In the material realm, almsgiving promotes detachment from the competitive economy of exchange and facilitates entrance into God's gracious economy. It also cultivates habits of charity towards the poor, who, like Abel, are victimized by economies of exchange, in which limited goods inspire violent rivalries. Chrysostom's emphasis on the gravity of fratricide, which goes beyond homicide, indicates the necessity of establishing stronger, recognizable bonds of fraternal charity, especially between those who give and receive alms. Such fraternal charity severs envy at its root by revealing more clearly God's gracious economy and the eschatological hope of the Christian community. Viewing the world and its desires as passing away leads to the formation of friendship between enemies and emulation in Christian virtue among would-be rivals. Third, perhaps the central theme of Chrysostom's homilies on Genesis is the long-suffering of the Lord, which is macrothumia, or patiencia in Latin translations, who constantly accommodates himself to human weakness. Chrysostom pleads in several places that his congregation imitate the Lord's patience, imitate the Lord's fidelity, and imitate every action characteristic of the Lord's love. Throughout his proclamation, Chrysostom highlights how the Lord refuses to abandon even the ungrateful and the envious, but urges them to make confession, to cultivate fraternal charity through almsgiving. Time and again, Chrysostom urges his congregation to learn the lesson taught by Cain about the destructiveness of envy as a goad towards their own confession and gratitude, detachment and almsgiving. Finally, the congregation is encouraged to emulate Abel, the one who was killed, whose longing for future goods was rewarded, Chrysostom writes, with the kingdom of heaven, in which Abel was welcomed as the one destined to reign for unending ages with Christ Jesus. In each case, Chrysostom shows how loving attention to the Word of God revealed in Scripture reconfigures one's outlook on the world as storied by God's abiding love. Conclusion, finally. In this essay, I've attempted to characterize Chrysostom's interpretation of Cain's envy as a complex integration of his rhetorical and philosophical training, together with his deep familiarity with the biblical narrative and its interpretive traditions. Aristotle's account of envy in his treatise On Rhetoric established three primary features of envy, subsequently illuminated by contemporary philosophical reflection, and especially that of Girard. Envy's three features include that pain experienced by the envious subject at his or her failure to possess some limited good as the result of the intervention of some rivalrous other, whose frustration of the subject's desire makes him or her the object of envy. Envy evidences a complex series of judgments, both about the desirability of goods and about the object of envy's likeness to its subject. Girard's analysis of envy within his broader picture of mimetic desire serves to illuminate the deeper logic of the classical account, how envy's various parts move within particular narratives, especially those in which envy's subject and object come to double one another. Although other late antique interpretations of Cain and Abel reflect aspects of envy's structure and its movement towards this violent conclusion, I argue that Chrysostom was among the most insistent regarding envy's role. In his Homilies on Genesis, Chrysostom unmasks envy at the root of Cain's fratricidal action, highlights for his congregation its disastrous effects. In doing so, Chrysostom evidences both a philosophical sensitivity to envy as a passion and a theological sensitivity to the reality of envy and its possible cures. Gratitude and confession, almsgiving and detachment, as well as sustained attention to the positive and negative exemplars within the scriptural narrative, are seen as means for mitigating envy. I hope to have shown Chrysostom to be a theologian whose reflection on envy in Scripture, alongside rhetorical and philosophical accounts, merits the sustained attention of all those interested in the study of the social and intellectual world of late antiquity, and hopefully Girardians as well. Thank you.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions. I'd ask you to please keep them concise or comments. Yes.
Not being a theologian, I might be asking a very ignorant question, a horse that has been beaten to death. But I was curious because some years ago, I became very curious about why God's attitude toward the Cain's and Abel's gifts, that word was translated so differently in different English versions. I checked the German version, a Swedish version, a Russian version of the Bible. And so I came to the Hebrew, I don't speak Hebrew, I came to the Hebrew word sha'ah, and I asked a Hebrew-speaking person with the knowledge of historical etymology, and the person told me that the connotations of the verb sha'ah are to turn to look at, and to see. So in other words, to me, it has a sense of, like intentionality. Basically, God saw Abel, turned to Abel, looked at him, and saw him, and didn't see Cain. So in addition to, what you mentioned, a good opinion of others, basically it was an act of exclusion, because it's the most painful thing if you're standing next to a person and the central person sees that person but doesn't see you. So I don't know, there's a question there somewhere. What do you think
Whether
about
or
that?
not the Lord in the narrative excludes Cain. Is that the suggestion? Okay, yes. It certainly is in the Septuagint text. I also sadly don't know Hebrew, but in the Septuagint, the Greek text, it is a verb for seeing and for regarding, I think, is one of the ways of rendering it. And I think Chrysostom's response to that, he consistently emphasizes the way in which the Lord sees into the hearts. And so his way of accounting for the regard for one offering and the disregard of the other is that he sees in Abel the upright intention of offering a gift to him from the firstlings of his flock, that he brought the best and the most appropriate gift. Whereas Cain's sacrifice, the Lord sees into Cain's heart and rejects his gift precisely because it wasn't offered in the same spirit. That's Chrysostom's analysis. I think deeper Girardian reflection, like on the particular narrative, might be able to do something even more interesting with the distinction that's in the Greek text between a gift and a sacrifice, and the reason why one was accepted and the other rejected. But that's the best I can do right now.
Hi. The rabbis say that one can mount lots of different midrashim about why one is rejected and one, and they do. But when I teach this text, I say sometimes things happen, and you have to deal with it. It's not that dissimilar to a line earlier when he said they had words. And sometimes people say, well, the text is broken there. We don't know what words they said, what was said, and who said it, and was Abel part of it. All we know is that they spoke. and then one rises up and chooses to respond. So in some sense, the text is performing our, and your interpretation adds to this, is performing what we do when we want to interpret. And
Yes.
there's no basis necessarily for interpretation other than mimetic structures. And so it seems to me that one has to say, look, how is the text staging what it is
Yes.
that we're doing as a reading?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that way of acknowledging how the mimetic structures are useful to this does fit really well with Robert Castor and Ed Sanders, these two classicists who've developed this notion of reading narrative scripts. It's like even if envy isn't explicitly there, when you analyze the situation, it can emerge as a possible option. And in terms of the kind of, the scandalon of, not necessarily in a Girardian sense, maybe more an origin sense of a scandal, of the sparseness of the text here, it does open up the possibility for amplifying the narrative, which Chrysostom and all of the Jewish interpreters do. The Aramaic Targumim in particular have the most kind of narrative amplification of the story to account for dialogue between the potentially twin brothers. So thank you, Professor.
Thank you. And I now will present the monetary award, $500 to Colum for third place in the Schwager Award. Yes. Our next speaker is Vivian Samba from Burkina Faso. He has 2 PhDs, the first one in philosophy. He wrote about John Rawls and the Political Society Project in Burkina Faso. His second is in systematic theology, done under the direction of Joseph Niemowski. And it is titled in English, I Believe in the Resurrection of the Body, Eschatology and Human Development in the Thought of Raymund Schwager. So we welcome you.
It's a great honor for me to be here and to make this presentation. But I must confess, I am a French speaker who tried to speak English in German context. Immigration towards Europe changed tragedy into drama according to René Girard and Raymund Schwager. Since summer 2015, migration has become a major subject of current social and political affairs, especially in the West. Migration continues, usually in the form of tragedy of which thousands of people are victims. How can migration be conceived with the intention of transforming tragedy into drama? Inspired by African authors, our reflections, which particularly consider African migration towards Europe, will be firmly set in the context of mimetic theory and dramatic theology. The media tend to give a macabre account of migration victims. In addition, they like to insist on the political causes as well as the economical causes: war, instability, persecutions, poverty, and misery. However, when reading several African authors, one realizes that the main cause of African migration is even deeper. Migration is psychocultural and, therefore, connected to the mentality. According to some African authors, Axel Kabu from Cameroon. According to these authors, the underdevelopment of Africa, which favors migration, is not caused by a lack of financial resources. It would be naive to keep believing that. In order to understand why this continent has not stopped deteriorating despite its considerable resources, it's necessary to question how this works at the most elementary microeconomic level, the minds of Africans. According to Kamana, within this fascination to Europe, migration takes place. Moreover, even if the Western world takes the form of a scapegoat that, in our imagination, has carried all our societies seen during the last 4 centuries, there is a sort of attraction that Europe exercises. According to Jean-Paul Nkupande, for this author, there is a dangerous lack of trust in Africa. Evidently, doubt has settled in the minds of these African peoples. This doubt slowly turns into a generalized sentiment of powerlessness. The encounter between Africa and the Western world gravely affect the minds of African people to the point where one can corroborate that in daily life. The Black Africa has been dragging around the heavy disabilities of conquered or humiliated societies that have not been able to overcome the generated defeat and frustration in order to find their self-confidence. According to another author, Ngelwe Muveng, the problem in Africa is an anthropological pauperization. The African fascination with Europe is expressed through a mimetic desire experiences as a complex of colonized people. It is the combination of admiration towards the victorious colonizer with the frustration caused by humiliation and an inferiority complex, all accompanied by a certain fatalism. All of this creates a paradoxical situation of tension and inhibition. According to those African authors, the real cause of migration to Europe cannot be found where people usually think it is. Rather, the authors have lacked the operative instruments to name and to describe this cause. And this cause negatively impacts on the economical and political situation in Africa and favors immigration. That presented, the complex of colonized people, more or less, corresponds to Girard's vision of desire as the driver of individual and social life. In the light of mimetic desire according to Girard. Short reminder of mimetic desire and violence. According to Girard, one starts to desire what the other desires. Then, one unconsciously desires as a rival and model what the other has desired. And finally, this mutual desire drives the protagonist to an ethnoclade desire of being in each other's plates and of even becoming one other. From this, rivalry can degenerate into violence. The African, according to me, the African want the power of Western people and the opportunities offered by their contact. But the memory of suffering and humiliation generates resistance. They come to terms with those who have militarily conquered and defeated them on political and economical level. However, at the same time, they developed protection mechanisms against their influence. They are being held in the shadow of the master and his dispositions. They actively cooperate with him while also complaining about him because he humiliates and exploits them. And the more intense the hate, the closer we are to the loyalty to rival. All this happens as if masters and disciples were chained to each other by a bond of mimetic rivalry. From the history, Africans learned to admire the victorious force of colonizers and developed a taste for the product consumed by their masters. This is how, progressively, for the black people, Europe became, for example, the condition of possibly becoming of human being. The developed condition of Europe is also part of that which commands respect and attraction. After hesitation, African people attend white school to learn to better connect the wood with the wood, and even to vanquish without being right, just like colonizers do. Mimetic rivalry reaches its peak when Africa dreams to catch up with and even surpass the Western world that now economically possesses her and shares her with other powers. That dream is in vain if Africa does not give up the blind mimetism which renders every effort ineffective. But how? Raymund Schwager and the problem of immigration beyond negative mimetism. Assuredly, the concept of dramatic theology can be attributed to Hans Urs von Balthasar, a compatriot who Schwager tried, besides, to interest in Girardian thought. But whereas the former conceived drama as an interaction between divine persons, the latter asserts that the interaction is between God and human beings, hence his strongly anthropological side. It was by falling back on anthropology soaked in a measure of Girard theory, it was by falling back on anthropology soaked in a measure of Girard's theory that Schwager came up with his dramatic theology in collaboration with the research group named Dramatische Theologie. According to this theology, the history of salvation is a transformative action bringing God into interaction with human beings. In Jesus Christ, the ultimate scapegoat, God absolutely acted in a peaceful way for human good and well-being. General approach. In fact, God smashes the mimetic triangle. In opposition to counterproductive rivalry, he opened the way for cooperation in the drama of the salvation and well-being. In the destiny of Jesus, who experienced the flight to Egypt, who grew up, preached the kingdom, revealed the true image of God, and who was taken out of the city to be crucified, God broke the violent springs. Indeed, in resuscitating him who understood his life to be a gift to himself for all victims, the Father confirmed his purpose. His Spirit, who always brings together the believers in the church, pushes them to make the Paschal peace a reality, which involves the human being, all human beings, and the whole human being. What can we learn from Schwager's approach? Two things. The first thing is the possibility itself of turning the migratory tragedy into a drama through a positive interaction that goes with a new, peaceful, and empathic view on the other. If it's positive, the encounter is normal, interactive, and leads to an outcome whose shape is not defined beforehand. As in dramatic composition, individuals and groups that meet one another become co-actors. Likewise, the action of one group leads to reaction on the part of the others and vice versa. The resurrection of Christ brings us to hope for a happy outcome. The second thing we can garner from Schwager for an alternative understanding of immigration is the change of mindset and behavior on the part of the human protagonists. To this end, the change of mindset and behavior should happen on two levels. The first level concerns the church, which is sacrament of salvation. It must engage practically itself with men and women in order positively to transform their life and their living conditions. The second level concerns the societies. Inspired by Schwager, who speaks of faith as following of the risen one, we suggest pistotherapy, formed from the Greek word pistis, faith, and therapia, healing. This neologism argues that we should include faith in the search for solution for human problems. Here, faith is understood to mean belief in God, as well as confidence in oneself and in the others. Conclusion. The underlying cause of African immigration towards Europe is the mimetic experiences as complex of colonized peoples that has shaped Africans' view of Europeans who are held up as model. In return, the European view of immigrants is such that the welcome is stuttering and immigration has become a tragedy. But in the light of dramatic theology, migration is not and should not be a fate. In Jesus Christ, there is a positive force at work for the salvation of all. This salvation includes well-being.
So again, we open the floor to comments and questions here. Nikki.
I would like to thank the last speaker by confessing that what you said made me uneasy. And it made me uneasy because you made such an effort not to make me uneasy. It made me ashamed because you were so careful not to make me ashamed. And the unease and the shame weigh very heavily on me right now, because what you described as the complex of colonized people, what you described through the usual Girardian dynamic is not something that a Girardian subject did. It's something that a mediator did. And the mediator is us, the Westerners, the whites, the whatever you want to call them. Well, whatever you want to call us, we need to accept that, because what we did to you is unforgivable. We set up consciously and systematically a system which positioned us as mediators, as ontologically superior. We said, there is a racial doctrine according to which we are above and everybody else is below. And we said, maybe, just maybe, if you behave, you may one day, if we feel like it, share in our ontological plenitude. Of course, that was a trap. And I feel that the way to make sense in a Girardian perspective of what we did to us, of what we did to you, is not by is by giving more weight to the figure of the mediator, of how the mediator can be manipulative, dishonest, self-serving, and evil. I feel that Girardian theory has huge potential to help Westerners come to a reckoning of what they did to other people, which included taking them in for like hundreds of years. Thank you for not making me feel more uneasy than I do.
Would you like to comment?
Thank you for the contribution.
Yes, here. And then
I have thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a very simple question. The question, in my understanding, a drama could be a comedy, a tragedy, and an absurd theater. So I am surprised, what is the change from tragedy to drama? It's from the word, from the term. What changes if you say drama? Because drama for me is an overall term to all these 3 or 4 categories.
Thank you. What you say is true, but in the perspective of Raymund Schwager, the drama had a positive outcome. And I have seen the situation in this perspective. Nicht nur tragedy, with thousands of people who died, aber eine possibility that immigration can have a positive outcome. That the host und the immigrant nicht zusammenleben, can live together. I have seen the situation in this perspective. It's why I have said, I have spoken about drama. If drama is always positive, but that's according to this Schwagerian perspective.
Someone back.
Thank you. Merci. Est-ce que vous pourriez expliquer, revenir sur le... Vous avez parlé à un moment donné de connecter le bois au bois, connecting wood to wood.
Mhm.
Could you explain that? Because I think I missed that totally. Thank you.
This comes from Chekamidukan, an African author. When he speaks about connecting wood to wood, he speaks about technology. The African attend the white schools in order to learn technology, Western technology. Also, we learn, the African would like to learn how can we connect wood to wood in terms of technology. Ja, aber nicht genug.
Thank you so much for this contribution, and the comments were made before also. I realize how difficult it is to go between the various languages, and when I heard one of your first sentences, you pronounced people as pupils, pupils being students. And I have been working with African students all my life, and I have made it a point that to make them understand that they are in the forefront of bringing African peoples to the realization that they should be contributing, and that we here, you know, we say that the refugees come because they see what we have and they want what we have, you know. But it's the same for the students, the pupils, come to have our things here and learn about Schwager and Girard and so on and so forth, and they have to get their papers judged on us. But they have a fantastic contribution to make. Africans, they have their own ways of looking at things, and I hope that you will be able to encourage other pupils to become contributing peoples.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, my question is exactly a follow-up on that. You went through your bibliography really fast, and if you can go back the slide. Yeah, I want to take a picture of it, but I also want to ask you a question about it. So exactly a point. We haven't been able to know all of these sources. This is wonderful that you're sharing with many of us have not seen the African voices. So if you can go to the bibliography page, because I wanted to ask you about one person there. That's the last one, the list of your sources.
Yeah.
Right.
The bibliography.
It's your sources list. It's the very last slide.
No.
Right.
All the way down.
All the way.
All the way down. All the way down.
You mean that one? Yes. Okay. So on your list there are Fanon, right? And so Fanon is the person who's most read in post-colonial literature in terms of theory, and one that, if any of us have read any of those, which that's probably true. So when I was listening to you and you were citing the other persons there with the, from their names, I presume they're African, that when you were listing those, some of what you were saying about their ideas sounded like Fanon. So my question is, were any of those figures in conversation with Fanon, influenced by Fanon, or are the views of what we would call negative consciousness, et cetera, that independently developed so that we have sort of a network of scholars who are emerging out of a colonial context and speaking in voices of the colonized, that similar ideas to Fanon but independently developed. So basically it's a question, what are the relation between those figures, Fanon and the other voices in your paper?
Fanon is in the perspective for post-colonial studies, right? My idea